Hello, it is Ryan, and I was on a flight the other day playing one of my favorite social spin slot games on ChumbaCasino.com. I looked over at the person sitting next to me, and you know what they were doing? They were also playing Chumba Casino. Coincidence? I think not. Everybody's loving having fun with it. Chumba Casino is home to hundreds of casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere, even at 30,000 feet. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com to claim your free welcome bonus. That's ChumbaCasino.com and live the Chumba life.
No purchase necessary. VGW. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.
Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13. Hello and welcome to It's Murder Up North. In the previous episodes, I covered the case of Charles Bronson, who has spent the last 50 years behind bars, often residing in a neighbouring cell in Wakefield Prison beside the man considered to be Britain's longest-serving inmate, Robert Maudsley. Bronson is often quoted as being the most violent, but Maudsley is deemed to be the most dangerous man in the prison system. And while there are parallels to be drawn between them, both were incarcerated in 1974, they've been patients in Broadmoor, and they have both acquired infamy while in prison. There are also major differences. Charles Bronson had a stable and loving childhood, and was given a chance to have a successful life. Yet Robert Maudsley was never offered the same opportunities, with his life being tough almost from the day he was born, tainted with neglect and abuse. And unlike Bronson, who had 2 chances at freedom, Maudsley has been continuously incarcerated since 1974 and has been segregated from other prisoners since 1979, giving him the dubious distinction of being the prisoner who has spent the most time in isolation. Over the decades, Robert Maudsley's crimes have been misreported and sensationalised. But what is the truth about the man dubbed Hannibal the Cannibal? Join me as I delve into the life and crimes of Robert Maudsley. Liverpool, in the northwest of England, sits on the River Mersey, which was the source of its wealth and prosperity. As the settlement defined itself as a key trading port, new factories and dockyards attracted many from the countryside with the promise of work. Like most of the great northern cities, Liverpool expanded rapidly, and homes were swiftly constructed to accommodate the influx in population. And although there were attempts to upgrade these houses in the early 20th century, many of the poorer areas remained with residents living in squalid conditions, which were made worse upon the commencement of the Second World War. Given its significant role in supplying the nation with food and other goods via its valuable dockyards, the city became a target for German bombs, with explosions raining down on the city between 1940 until 1942, with the dockyards, factories and people's homes being damaged in the blasts, while hundreds of people lost their lives. Although the war ended in 1945, its impact was still felt in the years to come. Many of the citizens became displaced and unemployed, with bombs claiming homes and workplaces. Rationing would continue until 1954, and many of the city's more run-down areas were scarred by bombed-out buildings and slum-like conditions, a situation noted by the medical officer of health in 1955, who stated that approximately 45% of the housing in the city, equating to roughly 88,000 homes, were unfit for occupancy. It was in this post-war existence that Robert John Maudsley would be born on the 26th of June 1953, just 2 weeks after Queen Elizabeth II's coronation. Yet the jubilant scenes in London were a short reprieve from the harsh reality of life, particularly in the Maudsley household. Although his father earned a living as a lorry driver, Robert and his 3 siblings, Paul, Kevin and sister Brenda, were often neglected, and by the time of his 2nd birthday, children were removed from the family home and placed into the care of nuns at the Nazareth House Orphanage. The Nazareth House children's homes, which were located throughout the UK, would face allegations of historic abuse in 2019, with approximately 400 individuals claiming that they had experienced both physical and mental abuse at the hands of the nuns. While many of these claims were made in relation to homes in Scotland, where an inquiry was launched, there have also been allegations made against orphanages run by Nazareth House from Newcastle in the north of England to Plymouth in the south, as well as Swansea in Wales. These complaints serve to demonstrate how widespread and systematic the abuse was. Although I have not been able to find any reports that such abuse occurred in Liverpool, it is worth noting that the strict routines and Spartan living conditions were likely standard throughout the children's homes. Despite this, it was the place that Robert and his siblings spent the happiest days of their lives. Although his sister Brenda was housed in a separate dorm, Robert developed a close bond with his brothers, which still exists today. Yet he failed to do so with his parents, having been separated from them at such a young age, and only seeing them during infrequent visits. He was denied the chance to form any parental attachment. This seems evident from his mother, Jean's comments, when speaking to the Reading Evening Post in March 1979. In the article, Jean spoke about the visits, but failed to mention any meaningful moments the pair shared. Instead, she recalled his behaviour during one visit, stating that, quote, "Bob was throwing a large stone at a glass window. I shouted at him to stop, but one of the staff at the home said no, let him do it. It's one way of getting things out of his system. I couldn't believe my ears." She went on to recollect another visit in which she witnessed her son standing facing a wall in silence, with her being under the impression that this was some form of punishment enforced by the staff. By the time her son was 7, the children were permitted to return home on a temporary basis, with the 4 siblings being reunited with their parents for Christmas. But they returned to Nazareth House just a couple of months later. The happiest days of their lives would end in 1961, when discussions of another family potentially adopting one of the children prompted the parents to reclaim them. At 8 years old, Robert and his brothers and sister were taken to the cramped, squalid place his parents called home, which he would share with his 3 older siblings and another 9 children who had been born either while the other children were in care or shortly afterwards. Despite the potential hardships endured at the orphanage, with corporal punishment, strict regimes, and a Spartan life, it would pale in comparison to what Robert would suffer at the hands of his parents. His brother Paul recalled the commencement of the abuse, stating that the move back home was, quote, "the start of a horrific campaign of physical abuse. It was something we'd never experienced before. They just picked on us, one by one, gave us a beating, and sent us to our room." Robert would also comment on this time, stating, "All I remember of my childhood is the beatings. Once I was locked in a room for 6 months, and my father only opened the door to come in to beat me 4 to 6 times a day. He used to hit me with sticks or rods, and once he bust a .22 air rifle over my back." Years later, Jean would comment on the relationship between Robert and his father, stating, "I don't think Bob has any love for his father because he hit him," going on to acknowledge that the beatings did occur. Quote, "Bob got the blame for everything, rightly or wrongly. His father was heavy with him and mocked him sometimes." However, in the 1979 Reading Evening Post article, Robert's father refused to accept that it was his strict and heavy-handed nature which impacted his son's future, instead placing the blame on the local authorities. The same authorities who were forced to intervene once more and remove Robert from the family, with social services placing him in foster care. Being passed from one home to the next, he lost contact with his siblings, who had cruelly been informed that their brother had died. By the age of 16, Robert was riddled with the physical and emotional scars from the abuse he had endured, and he would have his first brush with the law when he appeared in court to face charges for burglary and theft. In an effort to make something of his life, he headed to London in 1970 and found work at a petrol station. but his decision to steal money from the shop quickly ended that employment. Despite a brief stint on the Isle of Man, Maudsley would return to London in 1973, but unable to secure work or housing, he became one of the thousands of lost souls who arrived in the city every day looking for a dream, only for it to turn into a nightmare. While history recognises the late 60s and early 70s as a pivotal time for London, with the explosion of pop culture, vibrant fashion, and newfound freedoms for the post-war generation, who no longer felt bound to the conservative manner in which their parents and grandparents had been raised. The city, like the post-war generation, having cast off the scars of war, had become a thriving metropolis, attracting the biggest names in fashion and pop culture. And while this shiny rebirth is often depicted in films and the media, the city also had a darker side, one which, like the people lost within it, are often forgotten or hidden from view. When Robert Maudsley arrived in the capital, he had been tempted by the bright lights and promises of this new, shiny metropolis, but he found his experience to be very different to those we often see on the big screen, as he succumbed to its sordid underbelly. Maudsley was forced to sleep rough, either in parks, doorways or squats. He soon found himself involved in drinking and drugs, which he funded through sex work, collecting clients from the then seedy West End. Penniless and trapped in a vicious cycle, his only brief reprieve was when he ended up in Horton Psychiatric Hospital in Surrey, after being overwhelmed by dark thoughts, and had taken a drug overdose to end his life. During his stay at the hospital, he divulged to his doctors that he heard voices urging him to kill his parents. Despite this seemingly disturbing admission, Maudsley would return to the streets to fend for himself, where he was often taken advantage of by the men he offered his services to. Homeless people in the city were anonymous and invisible, a situation which would only be brought to light over the coming decades, with the efforts of charities like Crisis and Shelter, as well as certain infamous crimes that would illuminate how deadly being a forgotten member of society can be. It is likely Maudsley could have ended up just another faceless figure, huddled in a doorway on a cold winter's night, high on drugs or nursing a bottle of booze. But instead, he would become infamous, with his crimes being both shocking and celebrated, while his home would draw comparisons with a Hollywood film. His road to infamy started while he was still a lonely and vulnerable man, barely in his 20s on the streets of London, struggling to fight the demons having fled the memories of abuse in Liverpool, only to endure sexual assault and abuse in the capital. He would lose his battle when he met with a client called John Farrell, a builder who reports claims had already been convicted for child abuse. They met in a pub and headed off to a secluded spot, but Maudsley became uncomfortable when Farrell began showing him images of children he had abused. Having lured the 30-year-old into a toilet cubicle, Maudsley began to unravel. Disgusted at the images he'd been shown, the descriptions he had heard combined with his own trauma that was still raw, Maudsley couldn't fight his urges anymore, and he placed a tie around Farrell's neck and tightened it until the man's limp body fell to the floor. The need to kill was quickly replaced with the realization of what he had done, but instead of running or trying to conceal his crime, Maudsley turned himself in to the police, insisting he needed psychiatric help. He was found unfit to stand trial for the murder, and Robert Maudsley was sent to Broadmoor, which treated many individuals who were deemed to be criminally insane. Here he would spend the next 3 years as a patient, yet his time there would not be unblemished. A significant incident would occur in September 1976, when Maudsley, accompanied by fellow prisoner David Francis, took 22-year-old Philip Monk hostage, with the pair threatening to gouge out his eyes if they did not receive a pardon for their crimes. Throughout the siege, hospital psychiatrist Dr. Edward Unwin attempted to convince Maudsley and Francis to release the hostage, whom they had gagged and tied to a bed, where Philip would remain until the end of his ordeal 16 hours later. The repercussions of this event would occur on the 26th of February 1977. That morning, 15 patients had been allowed out of their locked single rooms to play or watch a six-a-side football match. Amongst them were Robert Maudsley and David Francis, who were both playing, while a third patient, 32-year-old David Cheeseman, watched from the sidelines. When the game finished at 11 a.m, Cheeseman asked a male nurse to open the boot room, which was accessed from the lobby of the Somerset block, where the men were housed. Permission was granted and Cheeseman, accompanied by Maudsley and David Francis, entered the room. But when the nurse tried to follow them, Maudsley pushed the door shut, with nurses Craig Evans and Berry Carlton drawn to the scene by the commotion, but found their efforts to hold the door open thwarted when Maudsley and Cheeseman produced weapons, with the latter holding Francis by the neck, a knife pressed against it, as he told the nurses, "To get out, I've got a blade." The nurses backed away as Maudsley began to barricade the door with a locker and football machine, and then tried to obscure the windows with pieces of wood, leaving all in the small slit in the door uncovered. Before the windows which looked out onto the lobby were blocked, the helpless nurses could see David Francis lying on the floor, his hands bound behind his back, and then David Cheeseman kicking him repeatedly in the stomach. Francis was then seated in a chair, with the flex of a radio bound about him and a gag placed in his mouth. After this, he would be subjected to a prolonged and tortuous ordeal. While inflicting horrific injuries upon Francis, the pair also demanded that they were permitted to speak to psychiatrist Dr. Edgar Udwin and another patient, Philip Monk, who had been the hostage during the September siege. From the other side of the barricades, the nurses could hear Francis being assaulted, and ever so often one of his assailants would be visible, having stood on a chair to look outside, or continuing to conduct negotiations. By the afternoon, sounds of screaming and sobbing had emitted from the room, which may have been when the pair had started to peel pieces of skin from their hostage's body, a detail disclosed by a nurse who alleged he was working at Broadmoor at the time. At roughly 2 p.m, nurses reported hearing the sounds of the heels of someone's shoes drumming upon the ground, with Cheeseman and Maudsley continuing to insist on seeing the psychiatrist and Philip Monk. While Dr. Udwin did not appear, the hospital's superintendent, Dr. Patrick McGrath, would arrive at the scene at about 3 p.m, but he refused the pair's request to exchange Francis for Dr. Udwin, insisting he was not going to put any staff or patients in danger. The siege would continue for another 6 hours before Maudsley ghoulishly held up the body of David Francis, allowing those waiting outside of the room a glimpse of the pair's handiwork through the small window in the door. After dropping the lifeless body to the floor, Cheeseman and Maudsley removed the furniture and walked from the room, leaving the bloodied and bruised David Francis behind them. When the pair were apprehended and searched, the staff realised that the knives which had been used to keep them at bay had actually been pieces of an antenna broken off a radio. Entering the boot room, the nurses were confronted with what has been reported to be a horrific sight, with suggestions that the man had possibly been sexually assaulted, with bodily fluids found on various parts of his body, his skin flayed, and a spoon handle, which had been sharpened, was protruding out of the deceased man's ear. The last detail has become twisted into the now legendary story that Francis's skull had been cracked open and Maudsley had eaten a part of the brain, earning him the moniker Hannibal the Cannibal, a claim he has always denied, and it is not substantiated by the post-mortem, which found that the brain was intact. I feel it's important to point out that the contemporary reports failed to mention the extent of the torture and brutality that Francis endured. This may be because these details were deemed too graphic for someone who would be reading them in the newspaper with their breakfast, During my research, I have found that a lot of the details seem to have become prevalent after the film Silence of the Lambs was released, and with Broadmoor's records often sealed, it cannot be certain which aspects may have been embellished over time, with the spoon in the brain being the prime example. In total, the siege lasted for 10 hours, and while a murder inquiry and an investigation into how the incident was able to occur would commence, it was also important to determine how David Francis had died, and if possible, whether it was Cheeseman or Maudsley who were the culprit. The pathologist carrying out the post-mortem noted extensive bruising and wounds on the body, with signs of compression to the neck, where markings consistent with an electrical cord were found, leading to the conclusion that Francis had been strangled. The death was said to have occurred at approximately 2 p.m, which was consistent with the time the nurses had heard the sound of heels beating on the floor, meaning this, and the gurgling noises they had heard, were actually David Francis's final moments of life. One thing could not be determined was who had inflicted what injury, and which of the two assailants had ultimately caused Francis's death. This was further complicated due to the fact that they both had blood on their clothing, and when questioned by the police, Cheeseman claimed it was a joint effort, while Maudsley stated he alone killed Francis. On Monday the 7th of March 1977, Robert Maudsley and David Cheeseman were remanded in custody at Winchester Prison, and a month later they would appear in court again, this time to request that press reporting restrictions be lifted, in order to allow them to disclose the conditions which they were living in at Broadmoor. Cheeseman stated, quote, "I think it is to my benefit that press restrictions are lifted, from the point of view of what has actually been happening in Broadmoor. There are certain things I would like to report to the press." This was a sentiment reflected by his co-defendant, Maudsley, with the pair producing statements which alleged that beatings were being carried out within the hospital, citing that consultant psychiatrist Dr. Edgar Udwin was not only aware of this violence, but allowed it to occur. The defendants would later explain that during the siege they had verbally abused the doctor, which they made no apologies for, claiming this was an acceptable action because of how he had treated patients in his care. However, these claims, whether true or not, would become overshadowed by the details that were divulged by Maudsley and Cheeseman at their next hearing 2 weeks later, during which they disclosed why they had taken David Francis hostage. The pair alleged that they had been planning to attack Francis since the siege in September, which was carried out by the deceased and Maudsley. The defendants claimed that during the 16-hour incident, David Francis had sexually assaulted the hostage, Philip Monk, who was a friend of Cheeseman's. Disgusted by the act, Cheeseman declared in December of 1976 that Francis will forfeit his life at my hands. With him teaming up with Maudsley, who shared the same goal, the pair began to carefully plot their revenge, which included rearranging the furniture in the boot room in preparation for creating the barricade. The duo knew that they would need to act before the 28th of February, which was the date Francis was due to be transferred off the ward. They identified the day of the match as an ideal opportunity, and having prepared the room 3 days before, when the 26th of February came, they were able to lure Francis into the room under the pretense of doing some cleaning, but once inside, he quickly became aware of their true intentions. Cheeseman disclosed to the court that once the door was blocked, he restrained, threatened, and eventually killed his hostage, stating, quote, "I dragged the flex from the record player and told Francis to lie down on the floor. I bound his legs so that his heels were against his buttocks. I told him I was principally concerned with what he had done to another patient. I told him he would not leave the room alive." With the assistance of Maudsley, Francis was then interrogated regarding the incident in September, likely in conjunction with acts of violence. During this intense questioning, they were able to elicit a confession, with Francis stating he had committed numerous indecent acts on Philip Monk, and he had raped him twice during the September siege, adding that he had the urge to do the same to another patient. Cheeseman continued by stating that he acquired the cord from a light and formed a noose, which he placed around the victim's neck. And he confessed, quote, "At about 2 p.m, I gave Francis another kicking about the ribs. He said, 'I know you are going to kill me, so get it over with.'" Cheeseman also explained that the reason he chose the option of strangulation was because it was quick and silent. Having initially both confessed to being the killer, it was clear in court that Cheeseman wanted to take sole responsibility for the death, alleging that he had done so while, quote, "consciously aware that my actions would cause the death of Francis." Maudsley, however, told the court he had been a willing participant in the crime, and admitted he was the one who had insisted on exchanging Dr. Udwin for David Francis, although he claimed his reasoning for this was not important. The two men would not be sentenced until October 1977, with the dilemma of whether to retain them in Broadmoor or place them in a prison, especially since prosecutor Peter Spencer suggested that the murder had not been solely about revenge but was, quote, "an extreme act of violence in an attempt to better their situation," suggesting that the defendants had intended to carry out a serious act of violence in order to leave Broadmoor, where they were detained indefinitely, and be placed in the prison system, from where they had a chance of being released. It would be David Cheeseman who would confirm this suspicion when he would appear before Justice Purchase during sentencing at Reading Crown Court. Standing in the dock alongside Maudsley and 7 prison guards, he listened as his lawyer, Ian Davidson, QC, not only confirmed Peter Spencer's allegations, but added to them by claiming that his client would commit more murders if he were placed back in Broadmoor, seeing this as what he dubbed a passport back to prison. This was backed up with Cheeseman addressing the judge, stating, "With due respect, my lord, to yourself and the court, I feel obliged to draw to your attention the serious consequences of the Home Secretary exercising his powers under the Mental Health Act. I vow that if discretion is exercised, and I will again appear before this court on a life indictment. This is not a threat, my lord. It is a statement of future fact," concluding with the chilling warning that he would kill again. In spite of fears voiced by both the hospital and Cheeseman's own secretary that releasing him back into the prison system could act as a motivation for other patients to carry out similar crimes in order to get the same result, the judge declared the imposition of a life sentence on both Maudsley and Cheeseman, with Judge Purchase concluding that, quote, "It is clear that you are both extremely dangerous men. I intend to recommend to the Home Secretary that he should consider this matter urgently and take action to achieve a transfer of you for a long time to an appropriate maximum security establishment." Due to the actions of Maudsley and Cheeseman, an investigation was carried out, which resulted in the creation of a special unit in Norfolk House at Broadmoor. This new wing would be for patients who were deemed to be, or had the potential to be, dangerous. These individuals would be held there under close supervision with stringent security measures. But Maudsley and Cheeseman would not be placed there. Instead, the decision was made to place them back in the prison system, where it was felt the appropriate level of security could be provided. While Maudsley had remained behind bars, his co-defendant would make the headlines in June 2006, when he appeared in court accused of the attempted rape and sexual assault of a 16-year-old girl, which had occurred 2 years prior. It was reported at the time of the incident that Cheeseman, who had changed his surname to Lant and had found God, was residing at Hollesley Bay Open Prison in Surrey, where he had been sent in 2002 to serve the remainder of his sentence. From here he was permitted to leave prison confines in order to work in a Salvation Army hostel in Ipswich as part of the reintegration programme. The 16-year-old girl claimed that in October 2004, Lant, who was on day release, had met her at a petrol station, under the premise that he was going to give her £50 he owed her boyfriend. During the meeting, Lant convinced her to join him as he went to his wife's caravan in Thurston, as he needed to check the electricity was turned off. She proceeded to tell the jury at Ipswich Crown Court via video link that once they were at the caravan he offered her £200 in exchange for sex. But when she refused, Lant produced a knife and began to threaten her, with the 16-year-old recalling, quote, "I was crying and he touched me without my consent." After this she was driven by Lant to a spot near Hollesley Bay Open Prison, where he sexually assaulted her on the back seat of the car, and then he let her go, 5 hours after she had encountered him at the petrol station. Lant, aka Cheeseman, who was 59 at the time of the alleged incident, denied the accusations against him, claiming that the act with the 16-year-old had been consensual. It was also revealed at the trial that Lant had been rendered impotent, having had prostate surgery in 2003, and although he had been prescribed with Viagra, it had not eradicated his impotency, with Lant telling the court that he could not have an erection, but did concede he felt pleasure from kissing and caressing the girl. Lant's full criminal history was disclosed to the jury, including the murder of David Francis, carried out alongside Maudsley. With all the evidence presented to them, the jury of 8 women and 4 men deliberated, and returned a verdict on the 5th of July 2006, in which they found him not guilty of 1 count of attempted rape and 5 counts of sexual assault. As Lant thanked the jury for their decision, the girl and her devastated family were left reeling, with her grandmother stating that she was flabbergasted by the result. However, following the verdict, Lant was sent back to a closed prison, and 4 years later, in December 2010, he was denied a release on licence, with the parole board indicating that they did not agree with the jury's verdict, stating that on balance of probability that the sexual act was not consensual. While his solicitors fought against this decision, I was unable to find any further updates on David Lant's status. While he had a chance of freedom, Robert Maudsley would be denied this opportunity, particularly after his actions while in Wakefield Prison in 1978. Less than a month after Maudsley and Cheeseman had been sentenced in 1977, another trial would be overseen by Judge Purchase, the outcome of which would prove fatal just 8 months later. The case, which was held at St Albans Crown Court on the 1st of November 1977, involved the defendant, Selmy Darwood, a 46-year-old man who stood accused of murdering his 51-year-old wife, Blanche. During the proceedings, prosecutor Mr. John Lloyd Ely described that the couple, who had 2 children, had been married for 12 years, but their relationship had been a tumultuous one, with the prosecutor describing it, quote, "The marriage was not happy, and there were a series of assaults on the wife. She was assaulted so severely, she had permanent facial injuries." He went on to report that Mrs. Darwood had made attempts to leave the abusive situation, to the extent that she and her children had sought refuge at a hostel for battered wives in Luton. It is alleged that she found the conditions unsuitable and was forced to return to the marital home, where she began the process of filing for divorce and getting an injunction to prevent her husband from approaching her, the children, or the house. However, until this was approved, she had no choice but to live with her abuser. Recalling the day of his wife's death, Darwood claimed that the pair had gotten into an argument over a television programme and he had strangled Blanche, with him telling police, quote, "It happened so blooming quickly. The next thing I knew, she was on the floor. I didn't intend it." When the police and paramedics arrived at the scene, they found him calmly washing cups at the sink. During Darwood's interviews, his composed demeanour unnerved officers, as he explained to them what occurred, describing how his thoughts became clouded by his fears over his relationship and that, quote, "the whole thing was falling apart again," adding that, "I loved her so much, I could not bear the thought of losing her." Darwood's defence, which was led by the same man who had defended Maudsley and Cheeseman, Mr. Ian Davidson QC, submitted a guilty plea for manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Mr. Davidson argued that Darwood did not pose a danger to the general public, adding, quote, "He can only become dangerous in an unusual circumstance, in another marriage such as this, for example." The manslaughter plea was accepted by the prosecution, and the judge duly sentenced Darwood to life imprisonment, with the possibility of parole. From St Albans, Selney Darwood was placed in a prison van, which transported him 160 miles north to HMP Wakefield, where 8 months later he would be found dead in Maudsley's cell. On the morning of Saturday, the 29th of July 1978, the inmates on the wings of Wakefield Prison were permitted out of their cells for lunchtime and exercise. And while his fellow prisoners socialised in the yard or ate their meals, Maudsley had the desire for a different activity, when he lured Selney Darwood into his cell. Darwood would be the first of Maudsley's 6 intended victims that day, as he launched a vicious attack on the 46-year-old man, using a 10-inch long homemade blade that he had wrapped in a cloth and concealed within his trousers. Within moments of entering the cell, Darwood was stabbed multiple times in the head and back, and as he attempted to get away from his attacker, he fell upon the bed, giving Maudsley the opportunity to pull out a cord from his pocket and strangle him until Darwood became limp on the bed. Wrapping the body up in the now bloody bedsheet, Maudsley then pushed the bundle beneath the metal bed frame, after which he straightened up his clothes, washed his hands, and headed off to hunt for his next victim. Some inmates stated later that they had seen Maudsley prowling the wing, and sensing the danger, some stayed clear, with one prisoner alleging that, quote, "they could all see the madness in his eyes." Unable to lure anybody back to his cell, Maudsley changed tact, and began to scour the wing seeking out anyone who was alone in their room. It wasn't long before he set his sights on his prey, in the form of 56-year-old William Roberts. Due to being convicted of the abuse and rape of the 7-year-old girl, the Sheffield-born Roberts, who had been sentenced to 7 years for his crimes, was despised by the prison population, ostracised by those who found his actions deplorable. He was a target for hateful words and violence. Maudsley had a particular hatred for men like him. As he entered the cell, Roberts was lying on his bed, and before he had time to react, Maudsley brought down the knife upon his victim's head. As his rage took hold, he grabbed Roberts and repeatedly slammed his skull against the cold stone wall until his victim fell unconscious, at which point Maudsley left the room. Whether there is actually any truth in the claims made by another inmate that Maudsley had intended to kill more victims is debatable, due to what occurred next. It is possible he was simply unable to find another opportunity to attack, or his urge to kill had been sated, but for whatever reason, he walked down the corridor to the guard's office and placed the bloody knife down on the desk, advising the guards that there would be 2 inmates short at roll call. While Maudsley was taken away to the segregation block, prison officers headed to the rooms, where they found Selney Darwood concealed under the bed deceased. While in William Roberts' room, there were still signs of life. He was rushed to nearby Pinderfields Hospital, where his wife would remain at his bedside until he passed away the following day. Subsequent postmortems of both men would find that Darwood had been asphyxiated, with clear signs of a ligature having been used, while Roberts had died from severe injuries to the brain. The dual murders cemented Maudsley's reputation as a high-risk prisoner, with the prosecutor, Mr. Barry Mortimer QC, describing him at the 1979 trial as one of the most dangerous and determined held in any jail, adding that, quote, "This man remains a serious danger to anyone who has to deal with him or is likely to come into contact with him." Mr. Justice Cantley echoed this opinion at Leeds Crown Court, while voicing his sympathies for those who have to handle Maudsley. while going on to state that he could not see a reason or a time he would ever be released. But he softened this with a more hopeful statement by adding, "But it may be that at some time something will happen which will enable you to be released." While there was no debate regarding the threat he posed, questions regarding what motivated the killings were raised, with multiple possibilities being presented. It was alleged by one prisoner that Maudsley had confided in him a couple of months prior to the murders that he was sick of Wakefield and, quote, considering doing someone in, convinced that this would result in a move to a different prison. Another inmate claimed it had been a ploy in order to get back to Broadmoor, where a man who had grassed on him had recently been sent, and Maudsley wanted to exact his revenge. Meanwhile, prosecutor Mr. Mortimer QC would put forth the idea that Robert Maudsley was a lonely man who had only one close friend in the prison, and this individual's removal from the wing had caused him to unravel. Maudsley corroborated Mr. Mortimer's assertion by later admitting he had been driven to kill because he, quote, felt depressed and lonely. My mate was moved into the segregation wing, and I didn't mix with anyone else. With regards to why he had picked Roberts and Darwood, Maudsley claimed that he hadn't purposely targeted them, suggesting that it was opportunistic, and it could have been anyone. It is worth noting that this narrative has changed since the trial, with it now being claimed that he had killed due to the trauma caused by his childhood, and he only targeted sex offenders and paedophiles due to his hatred of them. There is a notable pattern in his offending. His first victim had disclosed sexual acts he had committed on children. His second had raped a fellow inmate, and his fourth had sexually abused and raped a child. One could argue that his third victim, Selmy Darwood, does not fit the mould. Having been convicted of murdering his wife, whom he had been physically violent towards, it is not known whether the abuse extended to his children, but Darwood, being the violent patriarch of a family, may well have been the connection Maudsley formed, given his relationship with his own father. The idea that Maudsley's murderous actions had been a result of the trauma caused by the abuse endured at his father's hands was put forward to the court by his defence counsel, Mr. Edward Lyons QC, with Maudsley having stated that, quote, when I kill, I think I have my parents in mind. If I had killed my parents in 1970, none of these people need to have died. If I had killed them, then I would be walking around as a free man, without a care in the world. Mr. Edward Lyons QC argued that his client was a dangerous individual who required treatment for his trauma. However, he also voiced Maudsley's wish that he did not want to return to Broadmoor. This was a wish that would be honoured by the courts, with Maudsley returning once more to Wakefield. But this time, he had been designated a Category A prisoner, a status reserved for those who posed the greatest risk to others. Considered to be incredibly dangerous to staff and other prisoners, Maudsley would not be allowed on a normal prison wing. Instead, he was to be kept in isolation, his every move made with an escort of several guards. He would remain in this position until the Home Office had determined the best way to handle such an exceptionally hazardous individual. This was a situation members of Maudsley's family were eager to see resolved as soon as possible. Having reconnected with his sibling upon hearing about his crimes, Maudsley's brother, Paul, spoke on the inmate's behalf, arguing that, quote, he needs treatment. The only place he can receive the correct type of treatment is in a secure hospital like Broadmoor. Prison is not the right place for him. In a Reading Evening Post article from 1979, Paul had asserted that his brother's actions are the result of his childhood, stating that though they had the same experience, it had a negative impact on Robert. This had led to a very strained relationship between Robert and his parents, with Paul adamant that if his brother was released, it could have serious consequences, stating, the way Bob is now, if he was ever let out or got out, he would go for his father. This was a belief shared by the police, who considered that given Maudsley's claims that he has heard voices telling him to kill his parents, and that when committing his murders he thought of them, it is possible he would act on this urge. However, his father, speaking in 1979, dismissed these fears, and also downplayed the impact he had on his son's life by claiming, quote, "I never had a chance to show him any love. He was only with us a matter of months throughout his life." Having been deemed too dangerous to be in general prison population and considered untreatable by psychiatrists, a solution was needed. But in the meantime, Maudsley would remain in solitary confinement with limited socialization until 1983. This was a solution he and Liberal peer Lord Avebury greatly disagreed with, prompting the latter to advocate on Maudsley's behalf to the European Commission on Human Rights, with him stating that the main issue was the lack of social interaction available to Maudsley. Lord Avebury would state that, quote, "He would like to have exercised with other prisoners, and I think there are prisoners who would have been prepared to associate with him while he remained under conditions of close supervision. If he could establish that he is able to form relationships with others, it could in time lead to a freer regime for him." Perhaps as a partial response to this complaint, and as a possible solution to the concerns regarding how to handle Maudsley, it was announced in 1983 that 5 existing cells at Wakefield Prison would be knocked through to create 2 special secure rooms, with their own ensuite facilities. In an article from the 30th of July 1983, the Birmingham Daily Post described the new additions to the prison, stating that the cells are each 14 foot by 9 foot, with an adjoining 14 foot by 4 foot bathroom. They are painted stippled green with a table, chairs and bookshelf made from compressed cardboard. A coloured television has been put in the adjoining corridor, which both men will be able to watch through the glass windows. Each cell also has a small barred window overlooking the exercise yard. These highly secure cells would be where the inmates would spend 23 hours of their day, sleeping on a mattress that rested on a concrete slab, with very little privacy due to large perspex windows that allow guards a virtually uninterrupted view at all times. Access to the room is via a solid steel door, which has a serving hatch at its base to enable meals and other items to be passed to the prisoner safely. Both of these cells were designed to have access to a linking corridor, which enables the prisoner to leave the cell while remaining segregated from others, and meant they could have visits while remaining caged, thus reducing the risk of them harming anybody else. One of the only times the inmates left these confines was during the 1 hour of permitted exercise, when a minimum of 6 guards would still be required to escort the prisoner to and from the yard. While this did not solve Maudsley's complaint regarding socialisation, it was hoped the new facilities would offer him and anyone else held in the cells a better quality of life. These 2 rooms were seen as prototypes, with the potential to be replicated in other prisons, yet the Wakefield unit proved to be the only ones of their kind in the UK, with them being likened to the cell which housed Hannibal Lecter in the 1991 film Silence of the Lambs. It was reported in 1983 that the first occupants of these 2 high-security rooms would be a man who had killed 2 fellow inmates, whose name was withheld from the press, and Robert Maudsley. Apart from a brief stay at Parkhurst on Woodhill, Maudsley would remain in the cage at Wakefield, where he still resides today. And while he receives letters and has visitors, including his brother Kevin and Paul, alongside his nephew Gavin, his only other interactions tend to be with the guards or the prisoner in the adjoining cell, to whom he can converse via a specially reinforced window between the rooms. Lord Avebury would not be the only one to advocate on Maudsley's behalf. As stated, his brother Paul had already called for his sibling to receive treatment to help him deal with his childhood trauma, a sentiment echoed by psychiatrist Bob Johnson, who would work with Maudsley at Parkhurst from 1991 until 1993. It was on the hospital wing at Parkhurst Prison in 1991 that Dr. Bob Johnson first set eyes on the long-haired, thin-looking Maudsley, who had an unhappy disposition, and while the two didn't interact on this occasion, over time Maudsley would begin to ask the psychiatrist hypothetical questions relating to a friend, but Bob understood this was just a means of checking him out, to see whether his answers matched with Maudsley's expectations. When Robert agreed to speak to Dr. Johnson on an official basis, it took a considerable amount of logistics before the session could take place, due to Maudsley's risk factor. Yet the psychiatrist entered the prisoner's cell for their first meeting, and he sat at the end of the bed closest to the door, with the patient 10 feet away. Some of the information regarding their sessions was disclosed during Dr. Bob Johnson's interview on the Sean Atwood True Crime podcast, which was a fascinating exchange that covered his career and methods, and is well worth a listen. You can find the link in the show notes. When Dr. Johnson and Robert Maudsley had their first session, it was not a comfortable meeting for either of them, with the psychiatrist recalling that Maudsley began to complain that his hands were becoming sweaty. Sensing that his patient was already on edge, Dr. Johnson cautioned him by stating, quote, "If you frighten me, I can't help you." After a few tense moments, Maudsley's nerves eased, and by the end of the session, he agreed to meet with the psychiatrist again, with the pair having monthly discussions which became more frequent as time passed. Dr. Johnson has come to believe that those in society that are the most violent may also be individuals who have endured a traumatic childhood, an experience so profound that it has affected their emotional growth, forming an emotional paralysis in which the individual is trapped in their trauma. Unable to vocalize their feelings, they repress them, and often act out in ways that can be destructive or deadly. On the Sean Atwood podcast, the psychiatrist uses the analogy of a box, into which the individual has locked away their trauma. He points out that only they can open the container, but doing so too soon can have devastating consequences. Dr. Johnson believes that his role is to help them navigate their repressed feelings until they reach a point they can become convinced that the box is empty, meaning whatever is inside is no longer a threat to them. He has to convince the frightened child that they are now an adult, and they have the power which they lacked in their youth. With regards to the sessions, Dr. Johnson was convinced that Maudsley was making good progress. Each meeting saw him confronting the pain of his childhood. But Dr. Johnson also noted that it could be a disconcerting experience, describing how his patient would, quote, "get very agitated, and used to say, 'I've got a protector and he's coming in,' so I'd say, 'back off,' but did so gently." Through this method, Dr. Johnson felt like he was making good headway with Maudsley, whom he described as a cultured and intelligent man, forming the opinion that he was an individual who could thrive if his intellect was engaged and he was given a purpose. Dr. Johnson suggested to Sean Atwood that one of the ways of doing this would be giving Maudsley a job, stating, "I would employ Maudsley with a very high salary because he's got a good brain, and he should pay £10,000 a year for each family he has deprived a member of. Not lock him up, costing the state £500,000 a year. It's ludicrous. He needs to pay compensation for what he's done. I'm sure if I'd been able to continue, he would have done that." This, for Dr. Johnson, was his biggest regret, as he was not permitted to continue, and the sessions were ended abruptly by the prison authorities, who in 1993 would whisk Maudsley back to his cell in Wakefield. The psychiatrist firmly believes that had he been able to keep working with the quadruple killer, he may have been rehabilitated to the point he could have at least been permitted back into the general prison population. Yet all the efforts from the couple of years he had with the patient had been cast to one side, and Maudsley has remained in his glass cell ever since. Prior to his move back to Wakefield, there was one incident that occurred in Maudsley's cell at Parkhurst, where another prisoner was found hanged. It was reported in the Daily Record on the 29th of October 1993 that the coroner on the Isle of Wight wished Maudsley to appear at the court regarding this, but the request was denied, as the courts were deemed to not be secure enough, with the Governor of Parkhurst citing that Robert Maudsley was far too dangerous. While I could not find any further details on this incident, and there is nothing to suggest Maudsley was responsible for the death, it may have been a contributing factor in the decision to transfer him back to Wakefield. Returning to his Perspex cage, Maudsley would find his new neighbour both a companion and a nuisance, with him being located next to Charles Bronson. According to the recently released book Inside Wakefield Prison, Life Behind Bars in the Monster Mansion, the pair had an antagonistic relationship at times. The authors of Inside Wakefield report that the guards are told not to whistle while in earshot of Maudsley, as this has a tendency to rile him up. Allegedly, this is because it brings back memories of his mother whistling while he was locked in a cupboard. While the guards respected this, Bronson did not, often whistling in his cell, much to the disdain of Maudsley. Yet he also irritated Bronson by playing loud music, which would have aggravated his neighbour, given the sensitivity to noise Bronson claims he suffers due to years of isolation. The book goes on to claim that the relationship broke down almost completely when Bronson, who had been transferred to another prison, had sent Maudsley a watch, which the recipient rejected. Aggrieved by the snub, Bronson called Maudsley a, quote, ungrateful bastard, and swore he would get revenge, boasting that, quote, unlike him, I don't need a blade. Both Charles Bronson and Robert Maudsley continued to pose a problem for the prison system, with the pair becoming the focal point of discussions regarding the balance of punishment versus rehabilitation. The creation of close supervision units in prisons such as Durham and Woodhill in 1998 were hoped to serve as means of rehabilitation, where a regime of strict discipline was offset by rewards for good behaviour. Designated for the prisoners whose conduct is considered disruptive or pose a risk to the safety of those around them, the CSC was split into 4 levels, with one being the most restrictive, where the inmate is kept in solitary confinement for 23 hours, with just an hour of exercise a day, and absolutely no contact with other prisoners. They are also denied access to anything that may be considered a privilege, including books, and only through good conduct will they be allowed to progress through the levels, with level 4 being the least restrictive, and the point from which the individual may be allowed back to a standard prison wing. While Bronson did spend a short time in a CSC unit, with some reports suggesting Maudsley was either in Durham or Woodhill at some point, the decision was made that these settings were not appropriate for the pair. A spokesman for the prison service told the Liverpool Daily Post, "There are a very small handful, 2 or 3, who have been identified as unlikely to benefit from the CSC regime, and still pose an unacceptable risk to other prisoners and staff alike. It wouldn't be a case of giving up on them, but they are not progressing in the strict regime of the CSCs." The thought of being kept in isolation for the rest of his life made Maudsley lose hope, and in the year 2000 he petitioned the courts for his living conditions to change, claiming they were in contravention of his basic human rights and were affecting him mentally. In a passionate letter, he questioned the rationale behind keeping him in isolation, asking, quote, "What purpose is served by keeping me locked up 23 hours a day? Why even bother to feed me and to give me 1 hour's exercise a day? Who actually am I a risk to? The prison authorities see me as a problem, and their solution has been to put me into solitary confinement and throw away the key, to bury me alive in a concrete coffin. It does not matter to them whether I am mad or bad. They do not know the answer and they do not care, just so long as I am kept out of sight and out of mind. I am left to stagnate, vegetate, and to regress, left to confront my solitary head-on with people who have eyes but don't see, who have ears but don't hear, who have mouths but don't speak. All I have to look forward to is further mental breakdown and possible suicide. In many ways, I think this is what the authorities hope for. That way, the problem of Robert John Maudsley can be easily and swiftly resolved. In all, he just wanted a relaxation of the strict regime he was living under. He has always been permitted to have phone calls, receive letters, and have heavily guarded visits, but he wanted the freedom to socialise without the close scrutiny of guards, a chance to feed his genius love like you through the enjoyment of music, studying or taking part in workshops, to see the world, even if it was just on a television set, which he complained he had no access to. He even wrote a letter to the Times about his plight, stating that his only companions were the insects in his cell, and asking, quote, "Why can't I have a budgie instead of the flies and cockroaches and spiders I currently have? I promise to love it and not eat it." Maudsley closed the correspondence with a darker tone, reflecting his feelings of hopelessness regarding his situation, requesting he be allowed to end his own life. "If the prison service says no, then I ask for a simple cyanide capsule, which I shall willingly take, and the problem of Robert John Maudsley can easily and swiftly be resolved." His pleas went unanswered, and he remained confined to his lonely cell, with each year his chances being rehabilitated slipping away. His brother Paul argues that Maudsley's treatment is only keeping open the wounds of his traumatic childhood, invoking the memories of being locked in rooms by his parents. Paul is not alone in his opinion that Maudsley's punishment in prison is cruel and harmful, with each year of confinement denying him the opportunity or chance to prove he can be reintegrated. It has not been tested, so no one can know for certain what would happen if he was returned to general population. No one can predict how he would react to being amongst people, having spent the majority of his days alone within four walls, and what deep underlying issues this prolonged isolation has caused. Over the last 20 years, Robert Maudsley has garnered a lot of support from the general public, psychiatrists, and even prison staff, who believe that despite his crimes, he should be allowed to reintegrate. And yet, Maudsley's numerous requests to socialise have been denied, including in 2021, when he asked if he could spend his 47th Christmas behind bars in the company of others. Yet his appeal was denied, with him being advised that he will likely die within his cell. While he wishes to be allowed to interact with other inmates, his brother Kevin and nephew Gavin, who visit Maudsley regularly, have shared anecdotes that suggest that their relative is institutionalised and unremorseful. Kevin has told the Daily Mail about the visits he has with his brother, stating, "He seems happy enough in there. He seems all right. We have a good laugh. He's settled in. He wouldn't want to move. He'd rather be on his own than in the normal prison." While Maudsley's nephew, Gavin, speaking on the Channel 5 documentary HMP Wakefield's Evil Behind Bars, suggests his uncle does not express remorse for his actions, with Gavin adding that he may kill again, stating, "If you put him with rapists and paedophiles, I know because he told us he is going to kill as many paedophiles as he can. I'm not condoning what he did, but the people he killed were really bad people." This comment highlights the dilemma Maudsley presents to the prison service, especially when one considers the population of Wakefield Prison is largely made up of individuals who would be prime targets for a man like Maudsley. And regardless of public opinion towards him, with many celebrating his actions, the authorities have a duty to ensure the safety of all their prisoners, no matter their crimes. But surely at some point a compromise could have been struck, allowing him to interact with individuals maybe on a one-to-one basis, who were unlikely to be problematic. So the question remains, is it now too late for 71-year-old Robert Maudsley? Is he now past the point where rehabilitation and therapy would be effective? And could he, or should he, be allowed to interact with other inmates? I would love to hear your thoughts, and join me next time as I cover the case of another infamous inmate of Monster Mansion. So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.
How to have fun anytime, anywhere. Step 1. Go to ChumbaCasino.com.
ChumbaCasino.com. Got it.
Step 2. Collect your welcome bonus.
Come to Papa welcome bonus.
Step 3. Play hundreds of casino-style games for free.
That's a lot of games. All for free?
Step 4. Unleash your excitement.
Woohoo!
Chumba Casino has been delivering thrills for over a decade. So claim your free welcome bonus now and live the Chumba life. Visit ChumbaCasino.com.